Hello, powerful people. Welcome back to the Power at Work blog. And this Power Hour blogcast, my name is Seth Harris, and I'm a senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. So as regular viewers of the blog know, the Power Hour brings you top labor experts and invites them to comment on the biggest labor issues of the day. But for today's blogcast, I'll be blunt that we raise the bar a good bit. So this is our end of year blogcast. And what we're going to do is to look back on what is, I think, undeniably an important year for workers, unions, and worker power. So we needed to recruit two experts with the gravitas, the knowledge, the insight, the experience, the credentials to put 2023 into context. And we've loved every one of our guests on the Power Hour blogcast. They're all outstanding. But sometimes when it's the bottom of the ninth and the bases are loaded and there are two outs, you need to bring in your biggest sluggers. And so here we have two of the biggest sluggers in all of labor and employment law and policy. Steve Greenhouse was a reporter for the New York Times for 31 years, including 19 years as its labor and workplace reporter. He retired from the Times in December 14th. And it turns out that that was the beginning of a new career or another career for him. He's currently a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, and he's written for the Washington Post, the LA Times, the New Yorker, the Guardian, the Atlantic, and the New Republic. And he has a very important piece coming out hopefully very soon in the New Republic. And he was the author in 2019 of Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. He has also authored The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker, which was published in 2008, both by Knopf. The Big Squeeze won the 2009 Sidney Hillman Book Prize for a nonfiction book that advances social justice. So, Steve, welcome to the Power Hour blogcast.
Nice to be here, Seth.
And our other big slugger is my longtime friend, Cynthia Estlund, the Catherine A. Ryan Professor at NYU School of Law, where she teaches labor and employment law, among other things. Her most recent book is Automation Anxiety, Why and How to Save Work. That's from Oxford in 2021. She's published widely on law and regulation of work, including 3 earlier books, 2 edited co-volumes, and over 80 articles, book chapters, reviews, essays that range from collective labor law, employment law, traditional labor law, mainly on U.S. law, but also on comparative law. And so I will tell you, as a reformed labor law professor myself, and as a tremendous admirer of Cindy's work, she's not just widely read and widely plagiarized, but she frequently sees the future and sets the agenda for the discussion that is to come among her colleagues in the field. So I'm so grateful, Cindy, that you were able to join us today for the Power Hour blogcast.
Thanks.
So let's turn directly to our review of 2023 and what 2023 meant for workers and worker power and collective action. So let me just say, again, regular viewers know one of my favorite things to do is to reference my own work. So let me do that right now. So I recently published a post on the Power at Work blog that suggested, and I'll quote myself here, 2023 was a very important year for collective bargaining, perhaps the most important in a generation. So let me ask, open-ended, I'll start with you, Cindy. Do you agree with that sentiment? And could we expand that sentiment to say that 2023 was simply the most important year for workers, organized labor, worker power in a generation?
I think it might depend a bit on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist about labor. If you're an optimist, then I think there's much encouraging news that we've seen, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it from Steve on the collective bargaining front. Young workers are more enthusiastic about unions than I remember in my teaching career, which is very long by now, more than a generation, definitely. And so in those respects, I think it would be great for labor if we could look back on 2023 as having been the opening of a new chapter. Labor is in a deep hole, and it's a long, arduous process to dig out of it. But there was some great news in the collective bargaining context. I mean, I will say, and Steve will have more to say about this, I'm sure, that it's the big flashy deals in auto and the entertainment industry. These are legacy unions. They've been around for a long time. Their niches were established under conditions that we don't see anymore. And so time will tell whether those victories in those legacy sectors can be can generate some momentum elsewhere.
Steve, what do you think?
Seth, I fully agree with you that this year has been the most important for collective bargaining, with the greatest achievements, the greatest breakthroughs. Whether it's the greatest year in a generation for labor all around, I'd say 2022 was a more important year for organizing, because there were so many, huge breakthroughs. The first organizing of an Amazon store, the late 2021 were the first two unionizations of Starbucks and Buffalo, but then another 200 during 2022. That was huge. So the first, another anti-union company, Trader Joe's, was unionized. Apple stores were first unionized. REI stores were first unionized. Chipotle stores were first unionized. So that was 2022, which really gave a lot of impetus and a lot of publicity to unionization. Then, of course, there were the 20, 30, 40, 50 universities or graduate students and adjuncts unions. So 2022, I'd say, was bigger for unionization. But in terms of collective bargaining, we saw these, as Cindy was saying, these extremely important unions, the UAW, the Teamsters, the Hollywood, SAG-AFTRA, and the Writers Guild. They won, and I don't use this word lightly, historic contracts. I mean, the UAW boasts, but it's true, that they won larger raises in their contract fight and their strike with Ford, GM, Stellantis. The raises were greater than the union had won in the past 20 years. They won a 25% raise, and starting pay will go up 68%. That is huge. And remember, the UAW in the past 20 years was really on the defensive, really taking on the chin. So for its new leadership to turn things around like this is remarkable. And the Teamsters, James Hoffa was leading the union for 20, 25 years. He did pretty well, but he didn't win the spectacular contracts that his successor, Sean O'Brien, won. Bryan won a $7.50 average wage increase, which is more than the minimum wage. And starting pay for part-time workers, a big issue, is going to go up 50, 60%. And the Hollywood unions, at first, basically the studios were saying, go to hell. We're not going to agree to any protections on AI. We're not going to agree to minimum staffing for TV programs. And the union essentially went across the board. Their wage increases weren't spectacular the way they were for the UAW and the Teamsters. And there were other contracts I wrote about at Air Wisconsin. In October, the first officers won a 54% pay increase. The captains a 38% pay increase at United Airlines. The 16,000 pilots won pay increases between 34 and 40% at American Airlines. 15,000 pilots won 46%. In Oregon, 1,400 nurses at Providence Portland won raises of 17 to 27%. These are huge numbers. Yes, there was a 9% inflation, and workers wanted to recoup that. But not only did they, offset that, but they did much better. So let me say one more thing. I know I'm talking too much. So in ways, 2023 was the culmination of huge frustrations that were boiling up in the years immediately before. Workers were upset that their pay wasn't keeping up with the strong inflation. Many workers, hailed as essential workers, were extremely upset that every day They had to risk their lives working at supermarket cashiers or McDonald's cooks, and they weren't getting any extra pay, while white collar workers who are making $150,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year were comfortably at home. So I think a lot of rank and file workers, while seeing their pay stagnate and CEO pay soar and corporate profits soar and Wall Street share prices soar, they said this is really messed up. And plus we have the most pro-union president and God knows how long, and public approval for unions is the highest it's been since the 1960s. So I think a lot of workers, and plus we had a very tight labor market, so I think workers really felt angry. Plus they felt they had the wind at their back, and I think that produced this huge number of strikes, which led to really great results in collective bargaining. Last number. So the Cornell ILR labor action tracker says that there are 390 labor action strikes so far this year. That's over a 50% increase from 2021 over the same time period. And like 500,000 workers went on strike so far this year, which was like 8 times as many as in 2021. So, to paraphrase what Seth said, something's really happening. Something's really going on.
That's more eloquent than I think the way that I put it. And I think I'm gonna agree with you, but I think I'm gonna tweak a little bit Cindy's take on what happened in the collective bargaining. I agree with you that 2022 was a huge year for organizing. It's when we saw the breakthroughs that you listed, and I agree with you agreeing with me about 2023 and collective bargaining. I put myself very firmly in the optimist camp because I think that successful collective bargaining turns into successful organizing. While the Teamsters were negotiating with UPS, they had Amazon out of the corner of their eye. As SAG-AFTRA was negotiating with the Hollywood studios, they had the video game manufacturers out of the corner of their eye, and others in technology. While CWA was negotiating with the New York Times, they had all the other tech workers out of the corner of their eye. The UAW was looking at the electric vehicle battery manufacturers and the foreign automakers and Tesla and Rivian and those others, and now they're going after organizing them. And when you have the kind of rich contracts that Steve, you were just talking about, boy, is that a fantastically successful sales tool. Now, organizing, and Cindy couldn't be more right about this, organizing is fantastically difficult in America, still fantastically difficult. The law is stacked very heavily against workers. So I don't think 2023 sort of broke the fever and now we're living in a workers' utopia. I'm certainly not going to go anywhere near that far. And there are other contracts that we could have mentioned. The ILWU cut its deal with the Pacific Maritime Association. That was a terrific deal, all about average increase with a very, very high average, but also got a lot of other things, including protections against automation. The Hollywood studio strikes turned into protections against artificial intelligence that I think will turn into models for a lot of other unions. So I think there was a lot of other very, very, very important stuff that happened in 2023. The place where I think the dividing line is drawn between the unions that really have not been able to turn their organizing successes into contracts and the unions that have been tremendously successful is not legacy versus new. Because I think a lot of new unions, particularly on campuses, and I think this is Steve's point, a lot of campus unions and also unions that are organizing in the not-for-profit realm and in the certain like in the libraries and museums and other places have been tremendously successful. We've also seen a lot of success in the public sector with getting contracts for those new unions. I think the dividing line is this. There are unions that represent workers that have bargaining power in addition to their collective power. And then there are unions that represent workers that simply don't. And that power comes from either some barrier to entry into the occupation, skills, credentials, licensing, knowledge, work experience requirements. And workers like those baristas at Starbucks or like the people who work at that Amazon warehouse who are wonderful and contribute an immense amount, but they are sadly easily replaceable by their employers. And if you strike, you're at real risk of being replaced by your employer. And unless you have a mass number of workers like the Teamsters, like the UAW, like the coalition of Kaiser Permanente unions, the strike weapon is just not an effective weapon for you. So
Can I just
I think,
throw something
I'm sorry,
in,
go, no,
Seth?
please do. Please do.
I think one thing about the sectors you mentioned in which new unions are having success, one thing we have to notice about those, they're kind of soft targets. So public sector, universities, nonprofits, they that the line between those sectors, those unions, and private sector, that it's disturbing that corresponds so well. I do think that the difficulty of getting first contracts, something that Steve wrote this fabulous article that we'll all see soon, um, that we really this year might maybe bring more focus to that huge problem in the law on the difficulty of backing up the duty to bargain in good faith. But the fact that the private sector, which has the resources, the wherewithal, and apparently still the political cover to pull out all the stops, both in organizing and bargaining, to avoid actually having to make any concessions, is still a gigantic barrier for labor.
I want to agree with Seth on something and agree with Cindy on something. So in saying that 2023 was such a great year has been such a great year for unions, I was going on too long. I cut myself short in ways, forgive me, but it's extremely important that the UAW has launched this extremely ambitious campaign to organize, 13 non-union company, big non-union companies in the United States: Toyota, Tesla, Nissan, Mercedes, BMW, Rivian. That's huge. I mean, one of the big complaints among many worker advocates is that labor unions in the United States have not been aggressive enough in unionizing, that they're sitting on their hands while there have been various studies showing that basically one or two American workers say they would happily vote for a union if they could. So it's very important that the UAW is doing this. It might lead the way for other unions. And the Teamsters, I think, it's not as clear, are undertaking a very important, ambitious campaign at Amazon. And, Amazon is, for better or for worse, the iconic employer in the United States today, the way Walmart was 15
The white whale. They are the white whale. No question about it.
Go. And Sean O'Brien, the head of the Teamsters, is Ahab, and he really wants to capture his white whale, Amazon. And I don't think
you may not like that comparison.
I
don't think it turned out quite the right way if you use that as the analogy.
Fair enough. And then, and I agree with Cindy. On one hand, 2023 has been a very important year in terms of, bargaining achievements, and in terms of workers willing to mobilize and go on strike, and continuing the organizing victories of 2022. But you're absolutely right that if, we look back in 3 years and say they did not build on this, that it was a good one-off year, then we might turn around and say, well, maybe 2023 wasn't as big a deal as Seth and Stephen said. So we also, and just following up on one other thought, so at GM, Ford, Stellantis, UPS, Kaiser Permanente, Hollywood, the unions really have true strength, and they're. And I like Cindy's word, legacy unions. They've been around 50 years, 70 years. Whether these companies want these unions or not, these unions are there. They've learned to work with their unions, and they, and the unions could really squeeze the companies, as we saw. So they reached contracts at Starbucks and Amazon and REI and Trader Joe's. These are fledgling unions. And yes, it's great that the workers at Starbucks have unionized more than 360 Starbucks, but still it's only a fraction of the 9,000 plus Starbucks. So on one hand, they could go on a strike for 1 or 2 days, but it doesn't really begin to squeeze Starbucks the way the Hollywood strike, the GM, Ford, Stellantis strike can. So we have this disconnect where the legacy unions have the power to squeeze the hell out of the companies and get good contracts, but these fledgling unions, not at universities, which aren't as humongously, aggressively anti-union as Amazon or Starbucks. In these private sector anti-union companies, it's extremely hard to get a first contracts. And another thing at play is Starbucks knows, Amazon knows, Trader Joe's knows, Chipotle knows that if we agree to first contracts that give sizable raises and improve benefits, then all these other workers at other Starbucks and Amazons and REIs and Trader Joe's are going to unionize as well. So they really are doing as much as they can, I submit, to really delay unionization.
Right. They know what the Teamsters and the UAW know, and that is that bargaining success turns into organizing success, or at least an organizing advantage, not necessarily guaranteeing success, but organizing. Okay, so we're doing great, but I want to get to our second question because we're making so much progress, but I want to get to our second question. So I want to get you to hone in a little bit. So what was the most positive development of 2023 for organized labor, for workers, for worker power? And what was the most negative development in 2023? Stephen, why don't you go ahead?
So, the Flint sit-down strike of 1936-37 against General Motors, the auto industry was, extremely important then. GM was the biggest company in the nation, maybe even the world. And that victory really set the tone for labor in the years to come. And I think really the UAW, and I use the word victory against GM, Ford, and Stellantis, I'd say was the biggest development because it shows this iconic union, which for years was on the slides, was accepting concessions, had a horrible corruption scandal, an excusable corruption scandal. It elected new leadership, Sean Fain, who vowed to really pep up the union, invigorate the union, make it a bottom-up union, and he's done that. And they had this very effective strike, and they won these record contracts. And I think that we're talking about it, and so many other people are talking about it, and its influence, and 1,000 workers at Volkswagen in Chattanooga, have already signed union cards. They see the UAW has done great, and we want it too. One of the hardest companies, of course, to unionize will be Tesla because its owner Elon Musk says we don't want a union. Unions are bad because they portray people as lords and peasants, says Lord Elon Musk to his peasant. But all in, workers at Tesla get paid about $44 an hour, wages and benefits. And with the UAW contract, the average worker is going to be making well more than $60 an hour, including benefits. And that means a lot. And I think the UAW strike is the clearest advertisement in years about the benefits you can get in joining a union, although the UPS contract might be a close second. They did that.
Yeah.
I predicted that the Teamsters are going to go on strike, so then they could turn around and say, look at this great contract we won by flexing our muscles, but they won a great contract without going on strike.
That's right. Cindy, what do you think? Most positive development, most negative development?
Well,
Oh, Steve, we're gonna come back to you for your negative development in just a minute. Cindy, go ahead.
I guess I would sort of chime in with Steve and put a slightly different spin on it. I think that one thing we saw this year was the importance of great and creative leadership. So, Sean Fain at the UAW just re-energized and reconceptualized the collective bargaining process and executed brilliantly in a very, we have to say a very favorable situation, but still, favorable just in the sense the way the auto industry is organized. Fran Drescher on the Screen Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA. So I think, the energy from the base is somewhat mirrored in exceptional leadership at the top. And that is, that's a basis for some great victories. I think on the negative side, I think I would just point to the fact that with all these great victories and the organizing victories of the previous year and this year, hasn't quite made a dent yet in the actual union density. And so that just underscores the difficulty of the task ahead.
Stephen, let me come back to you for your negative.
I'm happy to. Let me just start. So I was asked to moderate the debates for the UAW presidency. So I moderated this debate between Sean Fain and Ray Curry, the incumbent. And Sean Fain, came across as the lefty militant that, we're going to do bottom up, we're going to go on strike, we're going to confront the companies. And I wasn't sure whether he was just blowing smoke or whether he meant it. But as Cindy said, he came in and he really, I love your word, reconceptualized the union. He really made it a fighting union that really wasn't going to demand just a 2 or 3% raise. They demanded 40%, which at first we thought was ridiculous. But, all in the raises they're going to win with COLA adjustments are going to be close to 30%, which is like
30.
pretty amazing. Most negative thing, I'd say the continued extremely fierce, ferocious, aggressive anti-union effort by Starbucks and Amazon. And, I was a newspaper reporter for the New York Times for 31 years. Despite what Donald Trump says, I'm very concerned about truth and accuracy. So when Starbucks says, it said at first, we are not anti-union, even as it launched arguably the most elaborate, expensive anti-union campaign, maybe in forever, or probably since J.P. Stevens in the 1960s, 70s. And now Starbucks says, we've never broken the law even once in fighting the union, even though there have been, 44 judicial decisions finding that it's broken the law and decisions finding it's fired 36 workers in illegal retaliation for supporting a union. So the extent, the fierceness of the anti-union effort has been amazing. I used to be at New York Times. I was once the New York Times European economics correspondent. So I covered the economy in Europe, and I interviewed a lot of CEOs in Spain and Italy and France and Switzerland, Sweden. And maybe they don't love unions, but they realize unions are established, important, and they use the phrase social partners, and that we have to work with unions to increase our profits, increase our prosperity. But here, so many companies, and you see this loud and clear with Elon Musk and with Jeff Bezos and with Howard Schultz, that they think unions are like trash and improper nuisances that they just want to stomp on like they're mice.
Third parties, right? Third parties, interveners, right? Outsiders. Yes.
So the most negative thing is how incredibly anti-union many American companies are. And so Elon Musk says unions are bad because they divide us into lords and peasants, yet he plays lord, telling people what they should do and telling them, who are you to say you should have a greater voice at work? We don't, we don't want our peasants rising up, and by saying we want more power, you're dividing us into lord and peasants, says Mr. Musk from his manor on the mountaintop.
Yeah. Cindy, do you want to get in on that? Go ahead.
Yes, I just have to tag on to what Steve said, because what it underscores, I don't want to particularly defend American management, but it's not just that they're, American anti-union it's not just management culture, or in any event, that management culture has been shaped by the peculiar American system of collective bargaining. So in Europe, fine, your entire sector is represented by the union. And so there's not really much point fighting a union at one company at a time. It's not going to do you any good across your sector. But in Starbucks, Starbucks, it's store by store. It's not even company by company. And so the modeling effect of one success and the modeling effect of one smashing loss, there's so much more to be gained from the victories on management side, so much more to be lost in their perception by a union victory. It's hard to see how we could undo this great, the path that we took back in the 30s. It's hard to see how we could do it without national legislation, which has obviously been a very more than heavy lift over the last several decades. But anyway, I think we just have to recognize when we look over at Europe, their entire system of union representation, collective bargaining, industrial relations is very different and much more favorable for workers.
Absolutely.
Following up quickly on what Cindy said. So wait, in Scandinavia, more than 90% of workers generally are covered by collective bargaining agreements. In Italy, it's up around there. In France, it's 90%. So that if you're a company and agreed to significant raises, basically all the other companies in your industry are doing the same thing. So you're not at a competitive disadvantage. So, Trader Joe's, McDonald's, whatever will say, well, we don't want to be the first folks in our industry to have unions and pay higher wages, through union contracts, because that will put us at a disadvantage. So that's a big problem. Another big negative, of course, and this is a perennial negative, is year after year, Democrats, pro-union forces try to get Congress to enact a law that would make it easier to unionize because, as Cindy and Seth and others have written ad infinitum ad nauseum, when companies break the law to fight unions, you really can't punish them. All you can do is slap their hands. And there have been many,
Right.
many efforts under President Johnson, President Carter, President Clinton, President Obama, President Biden to make it easier to unionize, to step up penalties against companies. And year after year after year after year, Republicans block it, through the filibuster in the Senate. That's another big continuing negative.
Right. So I'll pick up. I'm going to start with my negative, and then I'll talk about my positive. So I want to pick up on that point, and you both made this point, and I think you're both exactly right. The biggest negative is that 2023 reminded us, although we've known it for a long time, but it really came into very sharp relief in 2023 how feckless American labor law is, how ineffective it is, or as Cindy wrote, I think this was back in 2006, how ossified American labor law is. That was I quoted that article for years after she wrote it. It is just ineffective as a tool, one, to get employers to bargain, and two, to protect workers in an organizing context. You fire a worker, it takes months or years to get them back in the workplace. You refuse to bargain, the remedy is go bargain. And there's no really effective tools for ensuring that workers are going to be able to bring their power together into a collective, or that they're going to be able to exercise that collective power at the bargaining table. That, to me, is the distinguishing characteristic in the collective bargaining we've seen. Those unions with immense power and also with relationships with their employers successful. Those that don't, if you represent 360 out of 9,000 stores, one warehouse in a vast global chain, it's going to be very difficult for you to get a contract. And the law has very little to say with it and say about it. And let me say, this is at a time when we have arguably the most activist general counsel at the NLRB that we've ever had, with all due respect to my friend Fred Feinstein and the others who were terrific at their job and were really cutting edge in their time. But Jennifer Abruzzo has taken it to a whole new level, and she is trying aggressively to try to move the law, but she's constrained by the legislation. And the board that we have now is a very strongly pro-worker, pro-statute board. And they have been frustrated in trying to move things forward, partly because their processes move slowly, but also because they are limited. So I agree with that. I think I'm just sort of summarizing what you both just said. My big positive, I think, is maybe a little higher concept, but I think it's going to encompass some of what you said. And that is, for decades, organized labor has been acted upon. It has been, to some extent, passive in the face of employer opposition, globalization, technological change. And a lot of what it was doing was presiding over the decline, presiding over job loss, protecting what they already had, trying not to let wages go down too much, trying to limit how much offshoring was allowed, fighting legal battles to try to fight against fissuring of employment. And one of the reasons I came out of 2023 and 2022 very optimistic is, for the first time in a long time, I have felt like the labor movement is driving the agenda. They are deciding, and workers are deciding what's going to happen. You mentioned the UAW. I agree with that. SAG-AFTRA, ILWU, Teamsters, but it's happening across businesses, across industries. It's happening where there are no unions at all, and workers are just taking matters into their own hands, going out on one-day strikes. That's one of the interesting insights of the Cornell ILR Labor Action Tracker, is how many strikes or collective actions happen in places where there are no unions. So you have the sense that workers actually are having a meaningful say in the direction of their lives, which is, after all, why we have an organized labor movement. Now, I don't want to overstate it. It is limited because the labor movement remains quite small in our society, but it feels, for the first time in a very long time, maybe since my days out of college working in the labor movement, we didn't have it then, that we're no longer presiding over concessions and decline Instead, we're seeing the labor movement actually pushing to move workers forward and making the decisions that need to be made for workers to move forward. And we're seeing that in the political realm as well. It's not Joe Biden that's driving that, although obviously I'm a big fan. It's the labor movement that's driving a lot of what he's trying to accomplish, and he's in partnership with them. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic. Now, does that last? I don't know. That's one of the interesting things we're going to have to wait and see. But I feel like I sort of more of a gut feeling than an analytic sense is that there's been a change that workers actually are beginning to have some say in their lives, and I think that's really exciting. Okay, let me go to.
I'm just going to add
no, please, no, go ahead.
You know, totally agree with what you just said. But a big part of it is that young workers are super jazzed about unions in a way that our
Right.
generation isn't. I mean, I think they were very influenced by Bernie Sanders. Very concerned about income inequality. They really started coming of age during the 2007, 2008, 2009 recession when their parents took it on the chin, when their older siblings might have taken on the chin, when they, were starting to enter the labor market, and it's very hard. And they are fed up, and they also have this greater concept that we should be listened to. We should have a voice in politics. We should have a voice in at work. They've seen the Me Too movement. They've seen Black Lives Matter movement. That generation is really standing up and taking to the streets much more. And I think that energy and that ways militancy is, we're seeing it in the workplace much more than we did 10, 20, and 30 years ago. Maybe you'll disagree, but I think young workers and their approval ratings for unions is much greater than people in their 60s is.
Well, I agree with that, but I think we have to see whether or not that turns into union organizations that are actually activist. The unions that we're talking about, the UAW, the Teamsters, SAG-AFTRA, tend to be older workers, right? Workers with very, very long tenure. Maybe not our age, but maybe they are. They're not representative of those workers. But we're seeing organizing in the tech industry, in the retail industry, in the food service industry, where you have a lot of young workers. You also have a lot of workers who have college degrees and they're underemployed. They're in jobs that don't require college degrees, and that frustration and their desire to make their current jobs good quality jobs, I think is a part of what you're talking about. Let me get to a question that I know we wanted to address. So this is a big one, big open-ended one. And Cindy, I'll start with you on this one. And that is, what do you think is the most underappreciated development of 2023 with respect to worker power?
So I have been thinking and writing lately about remote work, which a lot of people have, but specifically thinking about its impact on the labor movement. So Steve alluded to this before, that the ability to work remotely has become, one of the great privileges. The rich get richer, and now they're richer in time and flexibility. And so the move to remote work is not affecting auto workers. It's not affecting Starbucks workers. It's not affecting a lot of the workers that are probably going to be on the front line of organizing. But for workers who can work remotely, I think we learned that remote work is here to stay. It was not just a COVID phenomenon. There's a big battle going on about back to work. But my point is simply that to the extent that much work does take place remotely, and in those jobs where work can be done and is done increasingly remotely because the technology is getting better and better all the time, that is, I think, inevitably going to thin out coworker ties that are kind of the lifeblood of organizing. Thin out those ties, and also to the extent that workers' relationships exist, such as they exist remotely through technology that's operated by the company, their connections are even more under active surveillance and monitoring by the company than they are otherwise in real life kind of workplace. So it's a worry. It's, for those workers who can work remotely, many of them want more of it. Obviously, if you get to skip your commute, your effective wage rate goes up just automatically. Your hourly pay goes up. Huge advantage for parents of young children. So many people crave the flexibility. So we can't really be, we can't be thinking, how should we clamp down on remote work? Workers want remote work. It might be part of what they would bargain for if they have unions. So it's just it underscores to me a message that I feel like I've been learning my whole scholarly life. Not all good things go together. So remote work it's a little bit of a sleeper phenomenon. It happened unbelievably fast. So as far as changes in how work happens, that was a lightning bolt. The impact will be much more diffuse, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Steve, what's your what you want to respond to that, and then your
I
underappreciated
agree
development?
with Cindy that remote work, is going to have huge repercussions. But it's unclear to me that the people who do remote work are mainly white collar workers, and they were often not the type who are going to unionize in the first place. So, and then at the same time, we've seen unions be surprisingly adept at using, email and Twitter X or Facebook or TikTok to organize. So, like they're trying to they're trying to organize remote call center workers. And I think they're being fairly successful rallying them together, but they have to overcome that huge hurdle of humongous anti-union fight back by the company. Anyway, so I guess I'd say the most unappreciated thing, again, it's a perennial, like, I think so many people, so many opinion makers, the phrase they use in Europe, the political class, the intelligentsia, just fail to realize how hard it is for the bottom 20-30% of workers in the United States. They struggle every week, every month to make ends meet. There's the Federal Reserve. Every 2 years, there's a study that finds basically around 35% of families of households, would have to sell something or borrow to pay an emergency $400 payment, whether, an emergency with a dentist or a car breaking down. They really don't have the $400. And you look at so many people just are saving up zilch for retirement. And I think one of the reasons we've seen, so much energy and impetus behind labor now is a lot of workers, those workers really had a hard time during the pandemic, and they're frustrated. And I think that's one of the forces giving so much energy to the labor movement, to unions right now. Unite Here, the hotel workers union, that's another union doing a great job and stepping up. And they represent a lot of workers who make $12, $14, $16, $18 an hour. And if you're making under $20 an hour nowadays and you have kids, it's going to be very, very hard. Again, that's not talked about enough. I mean, especially with rents rising and childcare in the United States is pathetically expensive and pathetically inefficient and often insanely difficult to get. So, for the lowest income 20-30% of workers, it's very, very hard, and more has to be done. And Biden did this great thing, provided child care tax credit of $2,000-$3,000 per kid for all these working class families, and the Republicans and Joe Manchin took it away, and that's unfortunate because that was one of the best things that had come along in years for working class families.
Yeah. Cindy, you wanted to get in. Go ahead.
Just briefly, I think one of the sleeper aspects of inequality is that the top and even much of the middle just lives in an entirely different world than the workers at the bottom. So back in the day, when all that great organizing, what is now the legacy unions, the manufacturing unions, the president of the company would go to the same grocery store. Well, perhaps his wife did, but in any event, every community setting, the top and the bottom, they were all part of the same community oftentimes. So one of the things that's happened with globalization and polarization is there's just none of that. There is no day-to-day contact anymore between the people at the top and the people at the bottom. And so I think when people, argue about whether it's really inequality we should be worried about, or just bringing up the bottom, Those are posed as alternatives. Clearly, we need to bring up the bottom, but it matters how far apart the top and the bottom are because of the politics of just not having any contact. And it's hard to have empathy if you don't have any contact.
I wrote in one of my books that during World War II, the CEO of tomorrow, the bank president of tomorrow, fought in the same trench as the coal miner of tomorrow or the steelworker of tomorrow, and there was a social solidarity that has really declined. And remember, it used to be that the headquarters of the company was built right next to the factory,
and they literally sometimes came up through the ranks.
Absolutely.
Right.
And they saw each other, and if someone died on the factory floor, the CEO would hear about it immediately because he was just across the way, and now
and would go to the funeral.
Yeah, and would go to and now a lot of corporate headquarters are very, very distant, as you said, Cindy. We're very distant from where the workers are busting their humps day after day.
Yeah. So let me say, I knew this was going to happen, that we were going to have way more stuff to talk about than we had time. But I want to sort of force us to our final wrap-up question for this end-of-year wrap-up of 2023. And it's very simply this. We've all agreed that there have been very, very important developments in 2023. The labor movement, many aspects of it have been tremendously successful in 2023. There are positive trends. The question is, will these positive developments, will these positive trends continue into 2024 and perhaps beyond? Cindy, let me start with you.
Well, we've managed to talk for quite a while without ever mentioning the elephant in the room. We can't really recognize that elephant anymore, the Republican Party. But what happens in the election is obviously going to be hugely important. It's going to affect what happens at the labor board immediately. So almost all the gains in labor law, which have been incremental to be sure, all at the board level, they're all reversible. It can take more time or less time, but they're all reversible. And we've seen over the flip-flops in administrations, an incredible amount of energy goes into reversing the last administration's moves, whether pro-union or anti-union. And so that's going to be an immediate effect. I don't like to think about what will happen, in the world more generally, but I think clearly that's going to be an enormous factor. Now, organized labor will be operating on, basically the same, arena as they were before. Maybe they will even be able to turn some of that into, positive adversarial momentum. But that is the one huge question mark in my mind about the future, of everything, not just labor.
Steve, what do you think?
I just finished writing a story for The Guardian, which will appear soon, about, can labor continue its momentum into 2024? And there are several issues. So 2023 had these huge labor disputes, 340,000 Teamsters at UPS, 150,000 auto workers at GM, Ford, Stellantis, 165,000 actors at Hollywood. Those are humongous labor disputes, and they got a lot of press attention. The ones coming up in 2024, 200,000 postal workers, they're not allowed to strike, 8,000 film crew members in Hollywood, 30,000 dock workers on the East Coast and Gulf Coast. Those are important, but not as huge as 340,000 or 165,000 actors, 150,000 order. So I do think that the huge gains that unions won in 2023 will help pave the way for good contracts moving forward. And I wrote a piece saying there's been a great reset where unions said we have to stop demanding just 3 or 4% a year. We have to really demand 20, 25, 30%. And I think that's forced corporations to reset. They realize we have to offer our workers more to help them keep up with inflation and to prevent them from going to other companies. So, there will be momentum in negotiations and collective bargaining, but maybe not the big strikes that continue this great publicity, momentum. Second, a very big issue, and we've discussed this, is can workers at Starbucks, Amazon, REI, Trader Joe's, Chipotle, Apple, who unionized 18 months, 2 years ago, finally get a first contract? That's a key issue about building momentum for workers. And if those workers do get good contracts, that will really create momentum in organizing more Starbucks and Amazons and so on and so forth. Third, as Sydney said, politics is very important, and unions. Michigan will be very important in the election. Wisconsin will be very important. Ohio will be very important. Pennsylvania will be very important, and labor will really have to step up, to help prevent Donald Trump from winning and perhaps the end of our democracy as we know it. So that's very important as well. So labor, I think it really has its win at the back. Maybe maybe the labor market won't be quite as tight, but I think people are feeling very good, very emboldened. And so I think labor will keep up some of the momentum, whether they can have some huge victories some of the humongous victories they had in 2023 will be difficult, but maybe it'll have modest-sized victories that will still be plenty good.
Right. So I'm going to be the biggest optimist on the panel, I think, for this. First of all, Steve, I would throw into that list of collective bargaining agreements that are going to be negotiated in 2024, Boeing, which is obviously one of the most iconic and important and huge manufacturing companies in the world, but certainly in the United States. That is going to be a critically important contract, and it'll be interesting to see how the machinists union, which has a new leader, is going to navigate that very, very complicated play there. So I think there are some very big contracts that are going to be maybe not as much as 2023, but still very, very important in 2024. I want to agree with you about the Starbucks, Amazon, Apple, et cetera. One of the intriguing things about those companies is they're all consumer brands. And one would think that as consumer brands, that they might operate a little bit more like universities and healthcare systems, not-for-profit healthcare systems, because they'd be worried about people hating their guts and refusing to do business with them. But there has not been an effort by any of those unions yet to organize consumers in order to put pressure on those companies. There have been, Steve, you've written about, and I've tweeted about the effort at Cornell University that was successful to get Starbucks off campus. There's one at University of Washington, a few other schools, but it's not being driven by Workers United as far as I can tell. The students are doing it themselves. That will be an interesting question for 2024 is, does the labor movement turn to consumers to provide them with more power in their dealings with those companies? I think that would be very hard with Amazon. I think it might be possible to put the kind of pressure on Starbucks that could make a difference. Steve, in your article, you talk about Starbucks losing stock value, $11 billion in stock value. I feel bad. We're like disclosing everything that's in your article in this conversation. But that's a very important development. And if you put direct pressure on them and it lasts, it can really be meaningful. But this is both an underappreciated point and I think a very important point, and why I'm highly optimistic for 2024. A lot of the growth in the labor movement that's going to occur in 2024, and I believe has already occurred in 2023, is organic growth, not the product of organizing, not the product of voluntary recognition. It's unionized employers getting bigger. And that's especially true in the building trades and in other industries that are being funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law, by the Inflation Reduction Act, by the Chips and Sciences Act. You're seeing project labor agreements. You're seeing other kinds of deals, neutrality agreements. The first semiconductor manufacturing neutrality agreement was just signed. Those are industries where the unions are going to grow very dramatically over the course of the next 10 years. The president of the Laborers Union, in a blogcast with me over Labor Day, said their union is going to almost double in size, go to 1 million members in the next 10 years. I think that's going to happen throughout the building trades. It's going to happen at the communications workers because of what's happening with broadband. We're going to see organic, very substantial growth driven by government investment, which will raise the floor for union membership growth going forward. So I think that that's extremely important. And it's sort of underappreciated in the discussion that we have. We're very focused on organizing at Starbucks because organizing is high profile and it's a conflict and it's very exciting. It makes a great news story and it's important, and I don't want to devalue it. But the growth that's going to happen because of the infrastructure law is going to dwarf the growth that's happened at Starbucks, the growth that's happened at Amazon, which together doesn't even amount to 20,000 workers. A big number, but nothing like what we're going to see on highways, in buildings, in manufacturing facilities. And there's a lot of private investment coming in behind that public investment that I think will make a big difference. Now, it's not as sexy, it's not as epical, but I think it's also extremely important. So let me see if you have any closing thoughts, and then I'm gonna thank you and say goodbye. But go ahead.
So 9,000 Starbucks workers have unionized, which won't be nearly as many as the number of construction workers that will unionize, with all the infrastructure bill. But I submit the Starbucks campaign is extremely important symbolically and substantively, because that's a very famous company. It's an extremely anti-union company, and if you could succeed there, that is extremely important. And it's trying to overcome, again, this fiercely anti-union company and the weaknesses of labor law. So, and it's no surprise, when I interview workers at Apple and Trader Joe's, they say, we were inspired by what happened at Starbucks and Amazon. So it is very important because, the private sector, we're down to just 6% unionization rate. And if you want to rebuild, you got to rebuild in places like Starbucks. And it's really hard. And that's why there's talk now of maybe mounting a nationwide boycott against Starbucks, because it's so hard, to get them to really negotiate in good faith. So
yeah, no, I agree. Let me say, I agree with that. Yeah. No, I agree with that. But I'm a big believer in taking the easy path as well as the hard path.
Absolutely.
So let's climb the short staircase as well as climbing the gigantic staircase to the top of the Empire State Building. You listed all the problems.
I taught you well, Seth. Yeah.
All right. Well, so we've more than taken up all of your time that we had promised that we were going to take up. And Cynthia Estlund and Steve Greenhouse, I knew this was going to be a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful to you for taking time. Thanks also to our technical producer. This is her last blogcast. Asia Sims has done just a phenomenal job, and I'm so grateful for the great work she's done on the blog and on this blogcast, but on all the blogcasts that she's produced over the course of the year. Thank you, Asia. Thank you also to our viewers and the supporters and subscribers to the Power at Work blog. We really appreciate you. We appreciate all those people who are sending us ideas for blogcasts and articles and interviews that we should be doing. We're grateful for that. You can watch these blogcasts. You can watch these blogcasts on the blog, but you can also listen to them on all the commercial podcast providers: Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Music. You can download them there. The holidays are coming. You're going to need stuff to listen to in the car while you're driving to your family. Go download the Power at Work blogcast. Search Power at Work on those sources, and you'll find them there. And subscribe to the blog on the front page at the bottom. Give us your name, your affiliation, your email address. We'll keep you up to date on all the great content we have. Thanks again, Steve Greenhouse, Cynthia Estlund, as terrific as I knew it was going to be. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Seth.